Ben tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the old townhouse came into view. The peeling paint on the shutters and the sagging porch gave it a rustic charm he hadn't expected. The rent was ridiculously cheap, and the location, on the edge of a quiet, wooded suburb, was exactly what he needed. He parked his car and stepped out, inhaling the crisp, cool air. "Perfect," he muttered, slamming the car door. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Hardwood floors creaked under his feet as he carried in the last of his boxes. The study, tucked into the back corner of the house, was his favorite room. It had just enough space for his desk, bookshelves, and the view of the overgrown backyard. The window, though small, let in just enough light to brighten the room during the day. As he unpacked, a strange sensation crept over him, as though someone was watching. He turned around sharply but saw nothing, just the blank walls and empty corners. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling as nerves. Moving to a new place always felt strange at first. By the time night fell, Ben was exhausted. He had set up the essentials, a bed, a couch, and a lamp for the study where he planned to unwind with a book. The rest of the boxes could wait. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and settled into his desk chair, the lamp casting a warm glow over the room. That's when he noticed it. A window. Not the small one overlooking the backyard, but a larger, square window on the opposite wall. He frowned. He hadn't seen it earlier. Approaching it, he realized something was wrong. There was no view. The glass was cloudy, and behind it, there was nothing but blackness. "Must have missed it somehow," he muttered, though doubt lingered in his voice. He tapped on the glass. It felt cool, solid. Shrugging, he returned to his chair, chalking it up to exhaustion in his own inattention. The next morning, Ben woke early, determined to start his new routine. With coffee in hand, he went into the study and froze. The window was gone. It wasn't covered. It wasn't hidden. It simply wasn't there. Ben stared at the wall, his coffee forgotten in his hand. Where the window had been last night, there was now only smooth, unbroken plaster. He stepped closer, running his fingers along the surface. It felt solid, completely normal. He shook his head and laughed nervously. "I must have imagined it," he muttered to himself. Still, the memory of the window lingered in the back of his mind. He distinctly remembered the cold feel of the glass beneath his fingers. How could he imagine something so vivid? The rest of the day passed uneventfully. Ben busied himself unpacking the last of the boxes, setting up his bookshelves, and organizing the kitchen. By the time evening rolled around, he was physically drained but glad to see the house finally starting to feel like home. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben settled into his study again with a glass of wine. He opened a book but found it hard to concentrate. Every creak of the old house made him glance over his shoulder. The room felt heavier, somehow. At first, he didn't notice it. But when he lifted his eyes from the page, his breath caught in his throat. The window was back. This time, it was slightly ajar, a faint draft making the curtain sway gently. His heart pounded as he approached it cautiously. The blackness behind the glass was the same as before, thick, impenetrable, like staring into a void. He reached out a trembling hand and pushed the window shut. The draft stopped instantly, and the room fell eerily silent. Ben stepped back, his mind racing. He grabbed his phone, took a picture of the window, and then sat down at his desk. For the next hour, he scoured the internet, searching for explanations. Could it be a hallucination? A trick of light? He found nothing that made sense. Feeling uneasy, he decided to leave the room. Maybe some sleep would help. At 2:47 a.m., Ben woke to a soft noise. A whisper. At first, he thought it was part of a dream, but then he heard it again, faint, almost inaudible. "Ben." His heart raced as he sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the study. Summoning his courage, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way down the hall. When he stepped into the room, the window was wide open. And from the other side, two glowing eyes stared back at him. Ben froze in the doorway, his hand gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. The glowing eyes in the window didn't blink. They were pale, almost translucent, and fixed on him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he took a tentative step forward. "Who's there?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The eyes didn't move. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Ben shone the flashlight at the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. No figure, no reflection, just the same empty black void beyond the glass. And yet, the eyes remained. Ben stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced for a rational explanation. An animal? A trick of light? But deep down, he knew neither was true. The whisper came again, low and stretched, as if the voice were traveling through thick water. "Ben, come closer." "Nope. No way," he muttered, backing toward the door. His hands fumbled for the light switch. When he flipped it, the overhead bulb flickered twice before bathing the room in a warm glow. The eyes disappeared. The window was still open, but now it looked ordinary. Ben approached cautiously, peering through the glass. Beyond it, he saw his backyard, illuminated faintly by the moonlight. Everything seemed normal. Except for the icy chill that still lingered in the air. For the rest of the night, Ben couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, the flashlight clutched in his hand. He told himself it was just stress, that moving into a new house and being alone in such a quiet place was playing tricks on his mind. By the time dawn broke, he felt foolish. The rational side of him had taken over, dismissing the events of the night as a strange but harmless anomaly. Maybe he was overtired. Maybe he'd been dreaming. Still, he resolved to inspect the wall where the window appeared. After breakfast, he grabbed a stud finder and ran it over the area. Nothing. He tapped the plaster, it was solid. Shaking his head, he muttered, "I need to stop freaking myself out." But as he turned to leave the room, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The curtains on the window were moving. And the window was closed. Ben stared at the window, watching the curtain sway gently as though touched by an invisible hand. The air in the room was still, there was no draft, no logical explanation for the movement. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to step closer. The glass was cold when he pressed his hand against it, colder than it should have been given the mild morning outside. He pulled the curtains aside and looked through the window, his eyes scanning the backyard for anything out of place. Everything looked normal. Except for a faint imprint on the glass, a smudge, shaped like a handprint, but with fingers that were impossibly long. Ben's breath hitched as he stared at it. He wiped the glass with his sleeve, trying to erase it, but the print didn't budge. It seemed to be etched into the surface. He backed away, his mind reeling. Was someone messing with him? A neighbor, maybe? But the house was isolated, he hadn't seen a soul nearby since he moved in. Enough of this, he muttered, grabbing his phone. He snapped a photo of the handprint and opened his landlord's number in his contacts. The man had seemed friendly enough when Ben signed the lease. Maybe he could shed some light on the strange occurrences. The call rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Frustrated, Ben left a message. "Hi, this is Ben, the new tenant at 112, Cedar Lane. I was just wondering if there's anything unusual about the house I should know about. I've been noticing some odd things. Call me back when you can." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Ben tried to distract himself by running errands, but the feeling of being watched followed him wherever he went. Even at the grocery store, he caught himself glancing over his shoulder. By the time he returned home, the sun was beginning to set. He hesitated at the door, reluctant to go inside, but he shook off the feeling. It's just an old house, he told himself. Nothing supernatural about it. Still, he avoided the study, opting instead to spend the evening in the living room. He left the TV on for background noise, hoping it would drown out his growing unease. Around midnight, Ben's phone buzzed. He grabbed it eagerly, expecting a callback from the landlord. But the screen showed an unknown number. Frowning, he answered. "Hello." At first, there was silence. Then a soft, distorted whisper crackled through the line. "Ben, look at the window." He froze, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What? Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead. The room suddenly felt colder. Slowly, as if drawn by some unseen force, Ben turned toward the hallway. From where he sat, he could see the study door. The faint glow of moonlight seeped through the crack at the bottom. The window was open again. And the whispers were calling his name. Ben's stomach churned as he stared at the faint light spilling from the study. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to stay put, but the whispers were insistent, calling his name in a low, distorted tone. "Ben, come closer." He stood, his legs shaky beneath him, and grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table. The hallway stretched before him, darker than it had any right to be. As he crept closer to the study, the whispers grew louder. "Ben, open it." When he reached the door, he hesitated. The light from the study was dim but steady, casting long shadows on the floor. He pushed the door open slowly, and there it was, the window. It was wide open again, but the void beyond it seemed different this time. The blackness swirled, like ink dropped in water, forming shapes that twisted and melted away before he could make sense of them. Ben's breath caught when he saw the handprints. Dozens of them. They were smeared across the glass, inside and out, overlapping in a chaotic, frantic pattern. The long, spindly fingers pressed against the surface as though something, or someone, had been desperately trying to get in. Or out. His pulse thundered in his ears. "What do you want?" he shouted into the room, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Then, slowly, a single phrase echoed through the room. "Let us in." Ben stumbled back, his flashlight beam darting across the walls. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow flicker, tall and thin, darting out of sight just as the light passed over it. "No," he said firmly, gripping the flashlight tighter. "I'm not playing whatever game this is." But the window seemed to pulse, the blackness churning faster, almost alive. A cold breeze seeped through the opening, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. Ben lunged forward and slammed the window shut, locking it for good measure. The whispers stopped immediately, and the swirling blackness vanished, leaving only the reflection of the room behind him. Except the reflection wasn't right. In the glass, he saw himself standing there, pale and wide-eyed. But behind him, a dark figure loomed, a shadow with glowing eyes, grinning. Ben spun around, but the room was empty. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of the living room, every light in the house blazing, the locked window still etched into his mind. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with him yet. And deep down, he wasn't sure he'd survive long enough to understand it. The next morning, Ben's resolve was hanging by a thread. He hadn't slept, his hands were trembling, and every small noise in the house set his nerves on edge. The image of the shadowy figure in the window haunted him, its glowing eyes etched into his mind. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his call log. Still no response from the landlord. Frustration boiled over as he slammed the phone onto the counter. If the landlord wouldn't help, he'd have to figure this out himself. After a quick search online, Ben found the local library's archive. If the house had some kind of history, anything to explain what he was experiencing, it would be there. Grabbing his keys, he left the house, glad to escape its suffocating walls. At the library, Ben approached the front desk. A middle-aged woman with glasses perched on her nose greeted him with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for any records about 112, Cedar Lane," Ben said, trying to sound casual. "Old property deeds, newspapers, anything." The woman's smile faltered. She glanced at him with a hint of concern before nodding. "That's an old one. Been here since the 1800s, I think. Let me show you where to start." She led him to the archives, pulling out a dusty box labeled Cedar Lane Properties. "Be careful with these," she said, lowering her voice. "Anne, if you don't mind me asking, are you living there?" Ben hesitated but nodded. "Yeah." "Why?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "People don't usually stay there long. You might find out why in those files." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left him alone. Ben sifted through the documents, his unease growing with every page. The house had a long and unsettling history. Tenants had come and gone over the decades, many leaving abruptly with no explanation. He found old police reports detailing strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, unexplained noises, sightings of shadowy figures. The most chilling report was from the 1950s. A family of 4 had disappeared without a trace. Neighbors reported hearing whispers coming from the house at night, and one neighbor claimed to have seen a black void where the living room window should have been. His hands shook as he turned the last page. Scribbled in the margin of a tenant's handwritten letter were the words, "Do not open the window. It's not a window. It's a door." Ben left the library in a daze, his thoughts racing. If the stories were true, the window wasn't just some strange anomaly, it was something far worse. Something connected to the disappearances. As he drove back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch toward his car, every gust of wind seemed to carry faint whispers. When he finally arrived home, the house loomed before him, dark and foreboding. The study window was visible from the driveway. And it was open again. Ben's heart sank. He stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. The house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you feel small. He walked toward the study, dread pooling in his stomach. The window was wide open, the black void swirling beyond it like before. But this time, there was something else. A hand. Long, spindly fingers gripped the windowsill from the other side. A shadow began to rise, its glowing eyes locking onto Ben as it pulled itself closer. Ben stumbled back, slamming the door to the study shut and locking it. But the whispers were everywhere now, seeping through the walls. "Ben, open the door, let us in." He backed away, his breath coming in short gasps. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. He needed help. And fast. Ben's shaking hands dialed the number of the only person he could think to call, his old college friend, Nate. Nate was the kind of guy who thrived on conspiracy theories and paranormal tales. If anyone would believe him, or at least not laugh him off, it was Nate. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Ben. Dude, it's barely 7 in the morning." "Nate, I need your help," Ben said, his voice tight with urgency. "Something's happening at the house, and I don't know what to do." Nate yawned audibly. "All right, you've got my attention. What's going on?" Ben hesitated, unsure of how to explain without sounding crazy. "There's a window. It's not always there, but when it is, I see things. Hear things. And last night," his voice cracked. Something was trying to come through. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Nate's voice, suddenly alert, "All right, I'm coming over. Text me your address." Ben exhaled shakily. "Thanks, Nate. I'll see you soon." Nate arrived an hour later, armed with an assortment of tools that ranged from practical, a flashlight and tape measure, to absurd, a handheld EMF detector and what looked like a bundle of sage. His shaggy hair and mismatched hoodie made him look more like a college student than the tech consultant he'd become. "All right," Nate said, stepping inside and immediately surveying the house. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Ben led him to the study. The door was still shut, and Ben hesitated before unlocking it. "It was open when I left this morning," he murmured. Nate nodded. "Stay behind me." He pushed the door open slowly. The room was exactly as it had been earlier. The window was wide open, and the black void beyond it swirled lazily, as though waiting. "Whoa," Nate whispered, stepping closer. He held up his EMF detector, which immediately spiked into the red. "Ben, this is off the charts. Whatever's on the other side of that, it's not natural." "No kidding," Ben muttered, keeping his distance. Nate leaned in closer, inspecting the edges of the window. "It's not even in the wall. Look," he ran his fingers along the frame, stopping abruptly when he touched the glass. "It's cold. Really cold." The void began to shift, dark tendrils curling and reaching toward Nate's hand. He yanked it back with a startled curse. "Okay, yeah, that's definitely bad." The two of them retreated to the living room, where Nate began furiously sketching diagrams and jotting notes. "So, here's what I think," Nate said, pacing the room. "This isn't a window, it's a portal. And whatever's on the other side wants in. Probably has for a long time." Ben ran a hand through his hair, his nerves frayed. "How do we stop it?" Nate frowned. "Well, portals like this usually need a source of power, something tying it to this world. Could be an object, a place, even a person." "A person?" Ben's heart sank. "Maybe," Nate admitted. "We need more info. Did you find anything weird when you moved in? Any old stuff left behind? Strange symbols? Creepy basement?" Ben shook his head. "Nothing like that. Just some old furniture, a few books, wait." His eyes widened as he remembered the attic. "There's an attic. I haven't looked up there yet." Nate grabbed his flashlight. "Then let's check it out. If there's something feeding that thing in the window, we're gonna find it." The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with old boxes and cobwebs. As they rummaged through the clutter, Ben found a small wooden chest, its surface covered in strange carvings. He opened it cautiously, revealing a bundle of faded letters and a worn leather journal. Flipping through the journal, Ben's blood ran cold. It was filled with drawings of the window, always open, always showing the same swirling void. The final entry read, "It comes every night. I can't stop it. If you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. Do not open the window. Do not listen to the whispers. Once it sees you, it won't stop." Ben and Nate exchanged a grim look. "That's not ominous at all," Nate muttered. But before either of them could say more, the whispers began again. This time, louder. "Ben. Nate, come to us." The house shook violently, and a loud crash came from the study. The window had fully opened, and the shadows were spilling out. The floor beneath them groaned as the house trembled. The whispers, once faint, now roared through the walls, each syllable twisting Ben's name into something unrecognizable. "Ben." Nate, step through. A loud crash echoed from the study. Ben and Nate froze, their eyes locking in mutual terror. "The window. We have to go," Ben hissed, clutching the journal tightly. Nate grabbed his flashlight and a bundle of sage. No way we're leaving that thing unchecked. If it's opening further, we're out of time. We need to stop it now, or it's going to spread. Ben hesitated, his instincts screaming to run. But he knew Nate was right. Whatever was happening here wasn't confined to him alone. If they didn't act, it might grow beyond the house, beyond them. They crept back to the study, the air growing colder with every step. The door was ajar, swaying gently as though pushed by an unseen hand. Beyond it, the window was fully open, and the black void spilled into the room in thick, writhing tendrils. "What the hell is that?" Nate whispered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive whispers filling the air. The tendrils pulsed as if alive, stretching toward the walls and floor, leaving dark, oily stains wherever they touched. In the middle of it all, the shadowy figure stood, its glowing eyes locked onto them. "Don't look at it!" Nate yelled, yanking Ben backward. But it was too late. Ben's gaze met the figures, and for a split second, he was frozen. A wave of cold swept over him, seeping into his bones. Images flashed in his mind, his worst memories, his deepest regrets. He saw himself arguing with his ex-wife, the look of disappointment on his parents' faces, the times he had let down his friends. The whispers grew louder, weaving through his thoughts like a snake. "Come to us, Ben. Step through the window. We can take it all away." A sharp burning smell snapped him out of the trance. Nate had lit the bundle of sage and was waving it toward the figure. The tendrils recoiled slightly, and the whispers faltered. "Snap out of it, man!" Nate shouted. Ben staggered back, shaking his head to clear it. It knows me," he stammered. "It's inside my head." "That's how it gets you," Nate said, pushing him toward the door. "But we're not letting it win." Nate reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial of salt. He began sprinkling it along the doorway, forming a rough barrier. The tendrils lashed out, striking the line of salt with a hiss, but they couldn't cross. "We need to close it," Ben shouted over the din. Nate nodded, his face pale. "The journal, there's gotta be something in there." "Look." Ben flipped through the journal with trembling hands, scanning the frantic scrawl for any mention of how to stop the window. His eyes landed on a passage near the end. "It feeds on regret. It draws you in with your own guilt, your own pain. To sever its hold, you must sever its tie. Burn it. Banish it. Do not hesitate." Ben's heart sank. "It says we have to burn it. The window, the portal, everything tied to it. Burn it? How do we burn a freaking window?" Nate shouted, dodging a tendril that lashed out at him. Ben's eyes darted to the journal and the wooden chest they'd found in the attic. "The journal, it's part of it. And that box. Maybe they're the connection." Without waiting for Nate's agreement, Ben threw the journal into the middle of the room, followed by the chest. "We need fire." Nate fumbled with his lighter, sparks flying as he tried to ignite the bundle of sage. The whispers grew deafening, the tendrils thrashing wildly, the figure stepping closer. Finally, the sage caught fire. Nate threw the burning bundle onto the pile. Flames erupted, licking at the journal and the chest. The effect was immediate. The tendrils retracted violently, the black void swirling faster as though collapsing in on itself. The shadowy figure let out a piercing, inhuman wail, its form flickering like a dying flame. The window began to crack, fractures spiderwebbing across the glass as the void behind it churned. "Get back!" Nate yelled, dragging Ben toward the hallway. With a deafening roar, the window shattered, shards of glass and darkness exploding outward. The tendrils evaporated, the whispers silenced. The house fell eerily quiet. Ben and Nate sat on the floor, breathing heavily. The study was a scorched ruin, the remnants of the journal and chest reduced to ash. Where the window had been, there was now only a blank, unbroken wall. "Is it over?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nate stared at the wall for a long moment before nodding. "Yeah. I think we got it." But deep down, Ben wasn't sure. The silence felt too heavy, too watchful. And in the back of his mind, he could still hear a faint whisper. "Ben, we're not done yet." For days, Ben tried to convince himself it was over. The study was unrecognizable, a blackened, charred husk of its former self, but the house itself seemed normal. The whispers had stopped, and the air no longer carried that bone-deep chill. Still, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. Every so often, he'd catch movement out of the corner of his eye, or hear a faint sound like distant murmurs just beyond his hearing. Each time, he'd tell himself it was nothing. Nate, on the other hand, was certain they had succeeded. He stayed for a couple of days after the fire, helping Ben clean up the mess and making light-hearted jokes to ease the tension. "You need to stop obsessing," Nate said one morning over coffee. "We burned the connection. The portal's gone. You're safe now." Ben nodded but didn't respond. He wanted to believe Nate, but deep down, he wasn't convinced. That night, Ben lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but the silence wasn't comforting. It felt wrong. At 3:14 a.m., he heard it. A soft creak. His breath hitched, and he strained to listen. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate groan of wood under pressure, like someone walking down the hall. Ben sat up, his heart pounding. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and crept out of the bedroom. The hallway stretched before him, bathed in shadows. "Nate," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. As he moved down the hallway, the air grew colder. The floor creaked beneath his feet, echoing unnaturally in the stillness. When he reached the door to the study, he hesitated. The door was closed, but a faint light seeped from beneath it. "No," Ben muttered, his pulse racing. "We destroyed it. It's gone." He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. Slowly, he turned it and pushed the door open. The study was empty. The charred remains of the journal and chest still lay in the center of the room. The walls were blackened, the furniture destroyed. But there, on the far wall, was the window. It wasn't open this time. It wasn't even whole. The glass was fractured, the spiderweb cracks glowing faintly with an eerie, pulsing light. Ben stepped closer, his legs moving against his will. As he approached, the faint murmurs began again, rising in volume with each step. "Ben, you can't escape." He stopped a few feet from the window, staring into the fractures. Beyond the glass, the void swirled faintly, as though it were struggling to return. And then he saw it. A face. It wasn't the shadowy figure from before. This was something else, something worse. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skull, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that was far too large. "Ben," it hissed, its voice 1,000 whispers in one. Ben stumbled back, his foot catching on the debris. He fell hard, the flashlight skittering across the floor. The light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The face pressed closer to the glass, its eyes boring into him. The fractures glowed brighter, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. "Let us in. You know you want to." Ben scrambled to his feet, grabbed the flashlight, and ran from the room. He slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it, his chest heaving. The whispers continued, muffled now but persistent. For hours, he sat there, refusing to move, his mind racing. Whatever they had done, it hadn't been enough. The window was broken, but it wasn't gone. And it wasn't going to stop. In the stillness of the hallway, Ben made a decision. If the whispers wouldn't leave him alone, he'd have to find a way to end it. For good. The next morning, Ben called Nate, his voice shaky but resolute. "It's not over," he said. "The window is back." Nate sighed on the other end of the line. "Ben, come on. We burned everything. You're just spooking yourself." "I saw it, Nate," Ben snapped. "It's cracked, but it's still there. And something's trying to come through." There was a long pause. Then Nate's voice softened. "All right. I'll come back. But if this is still happening, we need to dig deeper. Maybe there's something we missed." When Nate arrived, the two of them set to work, poring over every scrap of information they had. They revisited the journal's charred remains and scoured the house for anything they might have overlooked. It was Nate who suggested the idea that made Ben's stomach turn. "The window isn't just tied to the journal or the house," Nate said, pacing the living room. "It's tied to you." Ben stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "Think about it," Nate continued. "It feeds on guilt, right? Regret. It's been growing stronger because it's latched onto you. That's why it hasn't gone away." Ben shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "So what do I do? How do I stop it?" Nate hesitated. "I don't think you can fight it from this side. If it's tied to you, you might need to face it directly." Ben's heart sank. "You're saying I need to go through the window?" Nate nodded reluctantly. "I'll stay here and make sure you're safe. If anything goes wrong, I'll pull you out." With Nate's help, Ben prepared for the unimaginable. Armed with a rope tied around his waist, a flashlight, and a small vial of salt, he stood before the cracked window. The fractures glowed faintly, pulsing in time with his racing heart. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. "Ben, step through, we're waiting." Nate stood behind him, holding the rope tightly. "You sure about this?" "No," Ben admitted, gripping the edges of the window. "But I don't think I have a choice." With a deep breath, he climbed through. The moment Ben stepped into the void, the world changed. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against his chest. The darkness wasn't empty, it was alive, swirling and writhing with shadows that seemed to watch him from all sides. The ground beneath him was cold and uneven, shifting slightly under his feet. He shone his flashlight around, but its beam was swallowed almost immediately by the blackness. "Ben." The voice echoed all around him, layered and distorted. It was the same voice that had haunted him for weeks, but here, it was deafening. "Where are you?" Ben shouted, his voice trembling. The shadows moved, coalescing into a familiar form. The figure from the window emerged, its glowing eyes locking onto him. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, other shapes began to take form. Faces twisted in anguish, mouths open in silent screams. They surrounded him, pressing closer, their whispers filling his ears. "You brought us here, Ben," the figure said, its voice a chorus of 1,000 others. "Your guilt, your regret, it's all ours now." Ben took a step back, his hands gripping the vial of salt. "You don't own me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The figure laughed, a sound that made the shadows tremble. "Don't we? We are every mistake you've ever made, every failure, every pain. You can't escape us. You are us." Ben's mind raced. The journal had said the window fed on guilt, on regret. If that was true, then there was only one way to fight it. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," he said, his voice growing stronger. The shadows hesitated. Ben stepped forward, holding the salt vial tightly. "You're not my regrets. You're just shadows, feeding on what I used to feel. But I don't need you. I'm done carrying you." With that, he threw the vial to the ground. The salt scattered, and the darkness recoiled violently. The shadows writhed, their forms dissolving into the void. The glowing eyes flickered, and the figure let out a deafening roar. "No!" it screamed, its voice fractured and desperate. The ground beneath Ben began to crumble, the void collapsing in on itself. He felt the rope around his waist tighten as Nate pulled him back. With a final heave, Nate yanked Ben through the window. The two of them collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The window was gone. The wall was smooth and unbroken, as if it had never been there. Ben lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Nate nodded, helping him to his feet. "You did it, man. Whatever it was, it's gone now." But as they left the study, neither of them noticed the faint, almost imperceptible crack that had begun to form in the corner of the wall. The days that followed were eerily quiet. The oppressive whispers and creeping shadows were gone, and the house no longer felt cold and hostile. Ben began to feel normal again, or at least as normal as someone could feel after battling a malevolent force from another dimension. Nate stayed with him for a few more days, helping to repair the study and clean up the rest of the house. They painted over the charred walls and filled the space with light, hoping to erase any lingering sense of darkness. "You've got this, man," Nate said as he packed his bag to leave. "It's over. Just keep moving forward." Ben nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks for everything. I wouldn't have made it without you." As Nate drove away, Ben stood on the porch, watching until the car disappeared down the road. For the first time in weeks, he felt hopeful. That night, Ben sat in his living room, a book in hand and the TV playing quietly in the background. He allowed himself to relax, to breathe. He had faced the darkness, confronted his regrets, and survived. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease began to creep in. The air in the house felt heavier, the silence deeper. The book in his hands no longer held his attention, and his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway. Finally, he stood, unable to ignore the feeling. He walked slowly toward the study, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door was closed. He hadn't closed it. His pulse quickened as he reached for the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, he turned it and pushed the door open. The study was exactly as he had left it, clean, bright, and newly painted. But his gaze was drawn to the far corner of the wall, where a faint crack ran from the baseboard to the ceiling. "No," Ben whispered, his chest tightening. "It can't be." He stepped closer, crouching to inspect the crack. It wasn't just a crack, it was a fracture, faintly glowing with the same eerie light he had seen in the window. Ben stumbled back, his mind racing. The whispers began again, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "Ben, you can't escape us." "No." Ben shouted, clutching his head. "You're gone. I ended it." The crack pulsed, the glow intensifying. As he watched in horror, the fracture began to widen, spreading across the wall like lightning. Black tendrils seeped through, reaching into the room with slow, deliberate movements. Ben turned and ran, slamming the door behind him. The house seemed to groan around him, the walls trembling as if alive. He grabbed his phone and dialed Nate, his fingers shaking. "Nate! It's back! The window, no, the wall, it's cracking open. Slow down." Nate's voice was sharp. "What do you mean? I thought we destroyed it." "So did I." Ben shouted, pacing the living room. "But there's a crack in the wall, and the whispers, they're back." There was a long pause. Then Nate's voice came, grim and serious. "If it's back, we didn't destroy it. We only weakened it. And if it's getting stronger, we're out of time. We need to finish this once and for all." Ben swallowed hard. "How? "We need to destroy the house," Nate said. Ben froze. "You're joking." "No, I'm not. The house is the anchor. It's tied to this place, and as long as it's standing, that thing will keep coming back. If we want to stop it for good, we have to burn it down." Ben stared at the walls around him, his home, his sanctuary. The thought of destroying it felt impossible. But deep down, he knew Nate was right. The whispers grew louder, the house shaking violently. The decision was no longer his to make. Grabbing his keys, Ben bolted out the door, his heart pounding. If he was going to end this, he would need help. And he would need fire. Ben pulled up to the hardware store just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The quiet town streets were empty, and a heavy tension seemed to hang in the air. He grabbed everything he thought he might need: gasoline, matches, and a crowbar to break through anything that might try to stop him. His phone buzzed as he loaded the supplies into his car. It was Nate. "I'm on my way," Nate said. His voice was tense but steady. "You're sure about this?" Ben hesitated, glancing back at the house in the distance. The whispers were still faintly audible, even from here, clawing at the edges of his mind. "I don't think we have a choice," Ben replied. Nate arrived within the hour, parking his car next to Ben's. He stepped out, his face set in grim determination. "Let's finish this." The two of them approached the house together, the gasoline cans sloshing with every step. The whispers grew louder as they neared, now a constant murmur of voices, overlapping and distorted. The moment Ben opened the front door, the house seemed to shudder. The walls trembled, the floor groaned, and the air turned ice cold. "It knows what we're doing," Nate muttered. The crack in the study wall had spread, now covering most of the room. Black tendrils oozed out like liquid shadows, curling and writhing along the ceiling and floor. The glow from the fractures pulsed with a sickly light, and the whispers were almost deafening. "Ben. Nate, don't do this." The shadowy figure emerged again, its glowing eyes burning with fury. This time, it was larger, its form more defined. Its grin stretched impossibly wide. "You can't destroy us," it hissed. "We are you. We are everything you've ever been." Ben stepped forward, gripping the gasoline can tightly. "You're wrong," he said, his voice firm. "You're not me. You're just a parasite, feeding on my past. And I'm done letting you win." He splashed the gasoline across the room, coating the walls, the floor, and the black tendrils. The figure recoiled, hissing and writhing, but it didn't retreat. Nate followed suit, dousing the hallway and doorframes. "Hurry," he shouted as the house groaned violently, the shadows clawing at them. Once the house was soaked, Ben and Nate stood at the front door. The tendrils lashed out, desperate to stop them, but they couldn't cross the salt lines Nate had drawn earlier. "Do it!" Nate yelled, tossing Ben a matchbox. Ben struck a match, the small flame dancing in the dark. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand trembling. This was his home. The place he'd built for himself after everything had fallen apart. "Ben!" Nate shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. With a deep breath, Ben threw the match inside. The gasoline ignited instantly, flames roaring to life and consuming everything in their path. The tendrils writhed and shrieked, the shadowy figure twisting and contorting as the fire spread. "You think this will stop us?" it screamed, its voice a cacophony of rage. "You will always carry us with you." Ben stepped back, watching as the flames climbed higher, engulfing the walls and ceiling. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But you won't live here anymore." The two men stood outside, watching as the fire consumed the house. The shadows inside writhed violently, their forms breaking apart and dissolving into the flames. The whispers faded, replaced by the crackling roar of the fire. When the roof collapsed, sending sparks into the night sky, Ben finally exhaled. The weight he'd carried for weeks, maybe years, was gone. By dawn, the house was nothing but a smoldering pile of ash. Ben and Nate stood together in the morning light, exhausted but alive. "Do you think it's really over?" Ben asked. Nate clapped him on the shoulder. "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "You ended it. It's over." Ben nodded, staring at the ruins. For the first time in weeks, the air felt clean, the silence peaceful. But as they walked away, neither of them noticed the faint, blackened shard of glass buried in the ash. And in the reflection of the shard, two glowing eyes watched them leave.